There are two different types of errors that can happen when we do hypothesis testing, and they're very creatively named type 1 and type 2 errors, 1 and 2 using Roman numerals. So, sample data is used to decide whether or not to reject the statement in the null hypothesis. Because this decision is based on incomplete information, meaning it comes from sample data, there's a possibility of making an incorrect decision. In fact, there are 4 possible outcomes from hypothesis testing. So, we can make the conclusion that we do not reject the null hypothesis, and the null hypothesis is true. That is a correct conclusion. We could make the conclusion that we do not reject the null hypothesis, but in reality, the alternative hypothesis is true. That's what we call a type 2 error. If we reject the null hypothesis when it's really true, that's a type 1 error. And if we reject the null hypothesis when the alternative is true, that's another correct conclusion. So there's 2 ways to get the correct conclusion, and then there are the 2 errors. So let's talk about these errors. And I just went through this, but let's go through it one more time, writing it in words instead of just going by the chart. We reject the null hypothesis when the alternative hypothesis is true. That's a correct decision. If we do not reject the null hypothesis when the null hypothesis is really true, that is also a correct decision. However, if we reject the null hypothesis when the null hypothesis is true, that gives us an incorrect decision, and that's a type 1 error. If we do not reject the null hypothesis when the alternative is true, that's an incorrect decision, and that's a type 2 error. So let's do a couple of examples. In any trial, the defendant is assumed to be innocent. The district attorney must collect and present evidence proving that the defendant is guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. Because we're seeking evidence of guilt, it becomes the alternative hypothesis. And innocence is assumed, so it's the null hypothesis. What would be correct decisions made by the jury, and what would be type 1 and type 2 errors? So, the correct decisions, it would be correct to do what? Declare an innocent person not guilty. It would also be correct to declare a guilty person guilty, right? A type 1 error which is where we reject the null hypothesis, but it's true, would be to declare an innocent person. That's what we assume, is that they're innocent. But we declare them guilty. And a type 2 error, which is when we do not reject the null hypothesis, when the alternative is true, is to declare a guilty person not guilty. Okay, you try number 2. It gives us a scenario, and then it says asks you what a type 1 error would be in this situation and what a type 2 error would be. So you try to figure that out on your own, pause the video, and then restart it to see if you're correct. Okay, if you think you've got it, let's see. The Medco pharmaceutical company has just developed a new antibiotic for children. 2% of children taking competing antibiotics experience headaches as a side effect. We've had this problem before. A researcher for the Food and Drug Administration wishes to know if the percentage of children taking the new antibiotic who experience headaches as a side effect is more than 2%. The researcher conducts a hypothesis test with H0 being P equals 0.02 and H1 being P is greater than 0.02. So explain type 1 and type 2 errors. So type 1, remember, is we reject the null hypothesis when it's true. So we would say that sample evidence suggests more than 0.02, or we should probably say be better, more than 2% of children taking the medication experience headaches when the proportion of children who experience headaches from the medicine is actually equal to 2%. Okay, And the type 2 error, sorry about the lack of space here. Remember, the type 2 is when we do not reject the null hypothesis, but the alternative is true. So that would be sample evidence suggests that the proportion equals 0.02, but the true population proportion of children taking the medication who experience headaches is greater than 0.02. In the next video, we'll talk about the probabilities of making a type 1 and type 2 error, and then we'll talk about how we word the conclusion of our hypothesis test.